Good day, everyone. I am Clarissa Laribi Sabay, and together with my group mates, we will be tackling or discussing the topic language ecology. But before anything else, let's have an activity first. Now think of any words or ideas that you may associate with the topic language ecology within 5 seconds. If you already have your ideas or words, just stay still because we will going to find out if those words will be associated with language ecology. What you can see in your screen right now is an image or a diagram consisting the words language ecology, environment, and language. So what do you think is that all about? Well, we can clearly see that the language ecology has something to do or all about the relationship between language and of course its environment. We can say that environment and language are integrated. Environment determines and influences how the language is used. Language use is not only determined by a certain place where people live, but also by all the creatures in the world. In other words, the social and physical environment establish the forms and the function of language.
Good day, everyone. I am Orlin Pearl Ulay, and for today, let us continue the discussion about language ecology. So, there is a linguist who proposed a new approach to the study of language in multilingual societies, of which he called it language ecology, and defines it as the study of interactions between any given language and its environment. In this approach forces us to acknowledge the interactive and constructed properties of language in that it considers how languages are shaped and changed by their environment and how reciprocally the environment, physical, biological, and cultural, is shaped by the languages. It follows the metaphor of an ecosystem with a balance ensuring survival of all species.
Good day, everyone. I'm Rex Amandi, and today I'm going to discuss you the properties of language ecology. So, language ecology has 7 properties. It is the diversity, variation, transmission, lineage, selection and adaptation, niche, and the rate of change. First, I'm going to tackle you the diversity. So, what is diversity? Diversity is a measure of number of different kinds of species or languages in a region. What is critical is not so much that there are large numbers of individuals or even large numbers of types of organisms, but the organisms are meaningfully involved in these networks of relationships. And the third one is transmission. Like individual organisms of biological species, languages are transmitted from generation to generation. Transmission of languages is achieved through cultural learning in the context of communication, according to Tomasello 1999, and through the learning of memes, according to Blackmore 2000. An important difference is that transmission of language does not only happen vertically but can also occur horizontally across different speech varieties, from word borrowing or the introduction of novel cultural ideas. Another difference is that language do not make exact copies of themselves as do most biological organisms. And then, the lineage. A lineage shows the historical relationship of species or languages. A proper lineage will indicate which species or language are related to one another at the various stages of development throughout their histories. While both species and languages form lineages, in language, transmission can occur horizontally, that is, across lineages, when, for example, changes are introduced into a language from outside sources. The fifth property is the selection and adaptation. Just as the environment favors certain features over others, producing an organism better adapted to its environment, so does the physical and cultural environment interact with and favor characteristics in languages. Both human and natural selection operate to shape a language. In this sense, languages are also adaptive. That is, languages are interactively involved in making accommodations to their environment. And the next property is the niche. Languages also occupy an ecological niche as do biological organisms. A niche is a functional space inhabited by an organism that defines the network of interrelationships between the organism and its environment. In the case of language, the niche would include the network of social, political, economic, and environmental spheres within which a community of speakers carry out their activities. The last property is the rate of change. While both biological species and language undergo modification, another important difference between them is that the rate at which changes occur. Dependent as it is on vertical, genetic transmission from generation to generation, a species can only change only very slowly. The ecological approach to language, while challenging many ideas from traditional linguistics, at the same time offers fresh and exciting perspective through which we are able to appreciate the place of languages in a natural ecologies. Diversity is instead seen as natural outcome of a healthy ecology, an essential component of a natural system that sustains the cultural and social lives of groups coexisting in diverse environments.
Hello, good day. I am Shalome Baluis Marbebe, and now I will be discussing the main theoretical aspects of language ecology. First, language is an integral part of the dynamic system of sociality. So language gives the members of the speech community an ability to socialize with other people. Human sociality in the ecological picture of language involves three inseparable systems, which are community, communication, and culture. Second, language is situated. Language can only take place in real situation, the situation in which a speaker determines and engages the language he or she is going to use. For example, the situation is scene and participants. The participants are the individual participants and the relationship between the participants. Third, language exists as a pattern. Every part of human behavior is a pattern. This pattern leads people to learn how to act and perform something in their daily lives from the experienced and skilled people. Since they share the same patterns of behavior, those patterns will grow the sense of belonging to every member of community. Fourth, language rules are derived from patterns and play an important social role. The rules are important in language because they can describe the regulation of the underlying patterns we say and do. A rule is formulated because a problem occurred in everyday life. The last but not the least, meaning is negotiated. There are no words has a fixed meaning. The words in communication can acquire and change their meanings from the situation in which we use them.
It's a new day, fresh start, and new opportunities. Hello, good day, madayaw everyone. So we are here today to share our insight about the topic, nature of language policy and its domain. But before anything else, let me introduce to you the facilitators in today's lesson. We have Feline May Matmat, Lovely Luis Pamaybay, Ira Jade Valdez, and yours truly, Neressa J. Tabal. So without further ado, let's get started. By the way, what do you mean by the language policy? Language policies are born amidst the complex interplay of social, cultural, religious, and political forces. Actually, we all know na many countries have a language policy that is designed to favor either discourage the use of a particular language or a set of languages. So that's how language policy play its role. Although these nations historically have used language policies most often in order to promote one official language. For example, here in the Philippines, we have official language that is English, and we use it in a universal conversation in order to communicate with foreign internationals. So at that expense of others, many countries have changed their perspectives also to have these policies that is designed to protect and promote regional and ethnic languages whose valuability is threatened. So one example for that is our indigenous individuals. So how did they practice that language policy? They possess a tribal rules. For example, their scholar. So you as a part of their scholar, you need to use your tribal language as a form of formal communication or conversation, or even required to fluently understand and speak your languages. So in a way that in that policy, they can govern and preserve their linguistic items or ethnic languages. So it makes us realize that language policy does not only play its roles as a body of ideas, laws, regulations, rules, and practices, but to achieve the planned language change in the society, to promote or preserve the diversity of languages. So let's proceed to the second slide. To simplify it all, language policy is what a government does, either officially through legislation, court decision, or policy to determine how languages are used or cultivate language skills that is needed to meet national priorities or even to establish the rights of individual or groups to use and maintain languages. So guys, be reminded by that definition. And let's go on to the next slide. The scope of language policies varies in practice from state to state or community to community. That's why we are being possessed by how we practice language. Why? Because this may be explained by the fact that language policy is often based on contingent historical reasons. Because when we say historical contingents, it is how people in the past made history and make how historical events and trends result from a variety of factors coming together. So, if it will meet and come together, it may be the language policy or the scope of these language policies. Likewise, in the community, that literally differs the degree of explicitness in which they implement it as a given language policy, because in some areas, community base and contrast it with a degree of explicitness, means that they need official documented in written or a spoken type policy text. Okay, let's now move on to the components of language policy. But before further discussion, let's first answer the question, what language do you consider as a bad language and a good language? Actually, for me, bad language is consisting of harsh words, harmful words, and inappropriate and unacceptable in a certain endeavor. Meanwhile, the good language is uttered with manner. It is unoffensive and appropriate in a particular endeavor. But guys, it was just an overview to the component of language policy, because if we dig deeper in this, we will understand the essentials of language policy in the society. Are we all ready? Okay, let's get started once again. when we talk about language management, it may apply to these linguistic items. So first linguistic items is what we called an individual linguistic or the micro units. It maybe comes from the sound, the spelling, or the form of a letter. And then the second linguistic units and items is what we call collection of units. It maybe comes from the pronunciation, the lexicon, or the script. And then we have this third linguistic units which is specified and named as a micro variety. This comes from the language or a dialect. But let's just focus basically on language policy. Deals not just with named languages and varieties, but also with parts of language, so that it includes efforts to constrain what is considered as bad language and to encourage what is considered as a good language. Basically, one common set of criteria for badness includes words or expression that are obscene o malaswa, profane o kabastusan, blasphemous o mapanirang puri, fighting words in a way nga maningka, or as sexual words and expression. There is an opposing ideology that there is no such thing as bad language, so that there is an implementation or a solution to this. So one form of language management somewhat delicately leveled as a political correctness. So what do you mean by a political correctness? It is a term used to describe language policies or measures that are intended to avoid offense or disadvantage to member of a particular group in the society. Actually, it is being tackled in our previous lesson with Ma'am Pides. And it is not new to us, but to simplify, political politeness, it is the discipline in ourselves. Disiplina sa atong kaugalingon. The way we utter phrases that we think it's normally delivered, but yes, it is somehow offensive. Actually, guys, the constraint of bad language is a common example of language policy. For example, your mother told you, "Don't ever let me hear you say that words again." In Bisaya, bantay lang ka og madungga na puti ka ana ha. Then the second example is watch your language. There are ladies present. Maybe the customer is offensively say words or phrases that might point out to the ladies. So the question is, what do you think they need to restrain these phrases to be uttered? So let's proceed to the second slide. It is because the basic process of correcting or trying to correct language uses as a widespread belief that you as a listener or a parent or other caretakers have the responsibility to guarantee the successful socialization of peer by helping them to develop a variety of language that is useful for communication by being intelligibly, and that will lead to acceptance and desirable social setting by not giving offense. Always be reminded by that, by not giving offense. Actually, the caretakers generally accepting the responsibility to help their offspring learn an appropriate and good variety of languages. So one example for this is in the United States. So in the United States, obscenity, kalaswaan, is constitutionally left to the state or local government. But the federal government has a law dealing with the obscenity that crosses or might cross the state lines. Therefore, I can say that this person tries to correct one individual. They take the responsibility to develop a variety of language wherein it is appropriate and acceptable in a social setting, and also a variety of language that gives respect and manners to the person they conversing with. Be always reminded, guys, that bad language is considered dirty and impure. So we have to regard the language that is clean, unwrapped, pure language, and it is needed to be high valued in the society. Because in any platform, we really need to consider the filtration of languages. Kasi to practice ourselves in order to live a society with underlying purism. But in the case naman sa ating mga indigenous individual, it is understandable because they use this language policy to preserve their ethnic linguistic items. It is for the good and necessity for their tribes. And now, let's proceed to our second reporter. Take it away.
So, theory of language policy. So, there are four main features to the theory of language policy. So, the first is tripartite division of language policy, which is the classification of language practices, language beliefs, and ideology, and the explicit policies and plans resulting from language management or planning activities that attempt to modify the practices and ideologies of a community. So, language ideologies are this collective order that is the beliefs and attitudes that shapes a speaker's relationship to their own and others' languages, mediating between the social practice of language and the socio-economic and political structures within which it occurs. So, just to be reminded, that our first theory is the classification of these fundamental factors: language practices, language beliefs and ideology, and the explicit policies and plans, because it will help the society to identify these attitudes and shape of every speaker's relationship. So next is the second fundamental notion, which is that language policy is concerned not just with the named varieties of language, but with all the individual elements and at all levels that make up language. So language policy can apply to pronunciation, to spelling, to lexical choice, to grammar, or to style, and to bad language, to racist language, obscene language, or correct language. Of course, if we can notice, we really have this educational language policy that in order to convey the appropriate term, pronunciation, and correct language, we must consider this second theory because it will help us to identify the elements and all levels that make up a language. So the third fundamental notion is that language policy operates within a speech community of whatever size. So the domain of language policy may be any defined or definable social or political or religious group or community, ranging from family through a sports, a theme or neighborhood, or village or workplace or organizations or city or nation states or regional alliance. So the fourth basic notion is that language policy functions in a complex ecological relationship among a wide range of linguistic and non-linguistic elements, variables, and factors. With this, the relationship may be causal, but that will be often prove hard to establish. Even when we look at specific implemented language management decisions, we often find either no result, the failures of preachers or eradicate blasphemy are of teachers to enforce grammatical correctness, for instance, or unanticipated results, or the way that the reversing language shift or language revival activities produces novel, undesired forms of language. So now we will proceed to levels. So language policy in the family may be analyzed as language practice, ideology, and management. In many families, there will be no explicit language management but simply choices based on practice and ideology. The bilingual home, with its bilingualism produced by intermarriage, is an obvious locus for the study of family language policy. Besides intermarriage, one of the main pressures on family language policy is immigration, whether to another country or to the city.
Language policy is about choice. It may be the choice of a specific sound or expression or of a specific variety of language. It may be the choice regularly made by an individual or a socially defined group of individuals or a body with authority over the defined group of individuals. Growing up and becoming socialized, children are generally expected to learn how to differentiate between good and bad language. Their mentors and caretakers regularly take on the responsibility, first by encouraging the use of language that can be widely understood. So what kind of language that can be widely understood? In school, since we are expected to speak using the formal language, it is understandable that the language that can be widely understood or used is English. Hence, it is considered a good language because learners pay attention to this. It has a good technique to practice listening, speaking, reading, and even in writing. The second one is by encouraging the use of language that is judged favorably. During my senior high year, I've encountered junior students who speaks vulgar languages than I am, and I find it very awkward. The example that I provided is a kind of language in a certain discourse where their choice of words is judged favorably. When we are still a kid, we are taught of the words that others find offensive. That is why we try to compose ourselves first or the words that we're going to use when speaking. The beliefs that some variety of language is better than others and that is possible to influence speakers to select the better variety are fundamental to language and management. Now let's move on to the context of language policy. Looking at language policy ecologically has two different implications. First, it implies considering all the varieties of language that make up the social-linguistic repertoire of the community being studied, and not just the named varieties that are considered official or that represent specific ethnic groups. The social-linguistic repertoire then will include various linguistic items, variables, and varieties, but cross-link with the appropriate non-linguistic factors with which they coexist: demography, location, topic, and even function. The second one is implication is to realize that language policy exists in the wider social, political, economic, cultural, religious, and ideological context that makes up human society.
And now, let's proceed to the conditions for language policy. In analyzing a large number of various cases, Spolsky 2004, I have found four main forces that coexist with the various kinds of language policy. Forces may be too strong word with its implication of causality. Rather, they may be better thought of as a condition that occur with policies. Here are the four main forces that coexist with the various kinds of language policy. The first of these was the social-linguistic situation, the number and kinds of languages, the number and kinds of speakers of each, the communicative value of each language both inside and outside this community being studied. An important factor turned out to be less of a situation than the current perception of the situation. Therefore, the community is determined to be ignoring the number of language types being left behind or used by members of the left behind community. Much of this monolingual community is reportedly found to be multilingual by actual detailed analysis. The second condition had to do with the working of national or ethnic or other identity within the community. Schools are expected to teach a national language and citizens are expected to use it in public life. This unity can be encountered by the identity values associated with the language used by the ethnic or religious subgroups of the country. Many are trying to recognize a language in a parallel with or instead of the national language. The third force or condition had to do with changes that have taken place in the world in the last few decades as a result of globalization and the consequent tidal wave of English that is moving into almost every social linguistic repertoire. In the last few decades, this power has doubled its effectiveness and narrowed the choice of language. As a result, most societies that are now experiencing the effects of globalization are rapidly beginning to acquire better knowledge of the world language, English. This has various implications for a country's language policy. In some countries, it is the target of language management to combat its influence, and it can also become a natural goal of language acquisition plans and replace poorly developed indigenous languages. It does not affect language management, but it does affect language practices. The fourth condition has to do with the gradually increasing recognition that language choice is an important component of human and civil rights. Ratification of international agreements and the influence of supranational organizations need to increase the value of linguistic pluralism and recognize the right of individuals and groups to continue to use them, even if they respect national sovereignty and territorial boundaries and being aware of home language. As a result, more and more countries are including the recognition of limited number of rights for non-language speakers in their constitutional or language-regulated laws and ordinances. The state can allow the minority language community to provide its own teaching, provided that it usually teaches the national language along with the minority language. Proceeding to this question, can language policy succeed? Students of language policy fall naturally into two main groups: the optimists who believe management is possible, and the pessimists who assume that language is out of control. Baden seems to favor pessimists, as language management has relatively few cases of intended results. There is significant failure, such as the fact that revising language, switching activities generally did not prevent sustained brain drain when not controlled by a combination of government power and idealistic power. In many previous colonies, efforts to establish an indigenous language for official use are becoming increasingly problematic. In countries with high levels of immigration, the lack of language policy to recognize new social linguistic situation is causing major social problems. It can be argued that language policy mistakes are no worse than economic policy mistakes, but our records are not good. However, the purpose of this talk was not to endorse linguistic politics, but to try to understand what it is and how it can be affected. I try to identify the structure and essence for politics and study the interaction between its various elements. The knowledge gained does not indicate how to use the language, but it does help to understand what is relevant to such management.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I am Christine Tabirao. And for today's video, we are going to discuss about national language planning and policy. To officially start our discussion, I would like to define what is language planning and policy. According to my research, the term language planning refers to measures taken by official agencies to influence the use of one or more languages in a particular speech community. This planning is often associated with government planning, yet can be done by NGO or individuals. On the other hand, a language policy is designed to favor or discourage the use of particular language or sets of languages. It is also done by the government, officially through legislations and policies. And for you to know, the implementation of language policy varies from one state to another. Also, the major goal of language policy is to sustain, reinforce, and expand our local languages to provide the foundation skills for acquisition of English and other international languages. Now that we have discussed or defined what is language planning and policy, let us now move on to the history of language planning and policy.
History of language planning and policy. Language policy and planning, or LPP, is one of the fastest growing subdisciplines of applied linguistics. The LPP field was formed in the early 90s by language scholars interested in solving the language problems of new developing and post-colonial nations. Decisions around language policy and planning are made around the globe every day, both formally by governments and informally by scholars and community leaders. This decision influence the right to use and maintain languages, affect language status, and determine which language are nurtured. Language policy and planning decisions have a major impact on language vitality and ultimately on the rights of the individual. According to Cooper 1989 on page 45, language planning refers to deliberate efforts to influence the behavior of others with respect to the acquisition, structure, or punctual allocation of their language codes.
Language planning. So, what is language planning? It is a deliberate effort to influence function. Function means official function or nation, and its structure, meaning the spelling and how the words used in a language, and also the acquisition of a language within a speech community. So, acquisition meaning and how language learned, or how people educate the people that uses the language. So here are the four major types of language. The first is status planning. Status planning deals with initial choice of language, including attitudes towards alternative languages and political implications of various choices. Bright 1992. So, status planning is promoting a given variety of a language to be the standard language. It means it is a movement from a dialect to a language. And then the second is corpus planning. So, what is corpus planning? It deals with norm selection and the codification, as in the writing of grammars and the standardization of the spelling. So from the word itself, corpus, core, it is the change of the structure of a given language. Revise the grammars, you can revise it, and review the spelling system. And then the next one is the language acquisition. So the language acquisition, or the education planning, particularly important in education and choosing which languages will be used as mediums for instruction, is particularly important in acquisition planning, as one must not only learn language but use it to learn. So as what I've said, education planning, it is basically related to educational. It is about decisions of which language are going to be taught at schools as academic language or their second language. The next one is the prestige language. It is concerned with raising the prestige of any given language, in the present case African language, so that members of the targeted speech community develop a positive attitude towards it. So, raising the prestige of any given languages so that the members develop a positive attitudes towards it.
The objectives of language shift in different communities. So, at the end of this lesson, the students are expected to explain the cause of language shift in different communities, explain what are the factors that leads to language shift. So what does it mean when we talk about language shift? Language shift is the process by which a speech community in a contact situation that is consisting of bilingual speakers gradually stops using one of its two languages in favor of the other. Find out in this lesson how language shift occurs and the factor contributes to language shift. Language shift is the change from the habitual use of one language to that of another in particular community or society, based on Uriel Wainwright 1968. And according to Hoffman 1896, language shift is always preceded by multilingualism. Language shift results in the spread of the new language that's adopted and may result in the endangerment or loss of the old language. According to Anderson 2007, language shift is an inevitable scenario in the province of Pangasinan because of the several languages being used by the language community. Pangasinan seems to be at the battle against English, Filipino, and Ilocano, and Pangasinan is currently at the losing end of this battle. Partial language shift is happening in the province, and Pangasinan is being displaced by other languages in different communicative settings.
Now, have you ever thought about the possible factors why does a certain community undergo language shift? So, in this lesson, we're going to dig deeper and know what are the factors contributing to language shift. First, we have the economic factor. Language shift often reflects the influence of economic factors, such as the need for work. People may shift both location and language for this reason. Obtaining work is the most obvious economic reason for learning another language. For instance, people learn English in order to get a good job. Thus results in bilingualism. So when we say people tend to learn English for them to get a better job, because we all know that in this country, in this nation, in the Philippine country, we use English language as a skill for us to have a better communication, for us to get a good job. And that is why economic factor is one of the factors that contributes language shift. Second, we have the social factor. There is a pressure from the wider society. Immigrants who look and sound different are often regarded as threatening by majority group members. There is pressure to conform in all kinds of ways. So social factors, of course, for us to communicate socially, for us to become socially better in communication, we tend to adopt other people's language. Just like we're Bisaya and we tend to speak Tagalog whenever we're conversing with the Tagalog people. We tend to adjust for us to communicate with them. Now, third is the political factor. Political factor, a rapid shift occurs when people are anxious to get on in a society where knowledge of the second language is a prerequisite for success. Political chooses one language as the lingua franca to unify various kinds of ethnic groups. Consequently, the number of ethnic language speakers decreases. So, here also in the Philippines, we use English language as our lingua franca. Why? Because it's unify us. A lot of us, most of us actually speaks English language as our not so natural, yet we tend to practice English language for us to get along with our society, right? And so let's proceed to the fourth, which is the demographic factor. Demographic factor plays the role in the process of language shift. When there is a community of speakers moving to a region or a country whose language is different from theirs, there's a tendency to shift to the new language. Okay, so in the demographic factor, of course, when one family or one individual transfer from one place to another, they should have to adopt the language of the country they're moving in, for them to get socialized, of course, for them to have a better communication, and for them to make a living in that particular area. And so in that way, instead of using their vernacular language or mother tongue language, they tend to shift from the other language so that they can live a life in the place they chose to live in. And fifth and last is the attitude and values. Language shift tends to be slower among communities where the minority language is highly valued. When the minority groups support the use of the minority language, it helps them to resist the pressure from the group to switch language. Negative attitudes towards the language can also accelerate language shift. It occurs where the ethnic language is not highly valued and it is not seen as a symbol of identity. So in attitudes and values, from the word itself, when we say values, it means that you have put value to your mother tongue or to your minority language, and that results from avoiding or lessen the chance of shifting a language, because you perceive your language as your own identity. You give value to it, and so it's not so easily to remove it from your way of and from your means of communication while you're conversing to your family or to your friend. And also, the negative attitudes toward the language can also accelerate language shift, because instead of using your vernacular or your mother tongue language to your family, you tend to use the other language which you prefer. And in that way, you tend to shift from one language to your new adopted language, and that is basically the language shift already. And so, to sum up, language shift is an interesting and inevitable linguist phenomenon. The factors which trigger the shift vary from one language community to another. Some of them are demographic, attitude, values, economic, social, and political factors that I explained rather. And generally, people do not really stay in one place for their whole lives. Instead, they encounter opportunities that lead them to move from one place to another, resulting in language shift. Therefore, the language shift is a specific location has a significant impact. So, generally, when we say language shift, either you transfer from one place to another, or you just simply adopt one language from your own language. And for me, that has nothing to do with your own.
This moment, we will proceed to the cause of shift. The causes of language shift are generally multiple and interrelated. When we say interrelated, they are connected. So first, the absence of or presence of a higher education in the dominated language. Second, relatively larger or relatively small number of speakers of the dominated language. Greater similarity or greater dissimilarity between groups speaking the dominant and dominated language. Lastly, the positive and hostile attitudes of dominant group towards the minority group. Next, we will discuss about the migrant minorities. The order of domains in which language shift occurs may differ from different individuals and different groups, but gradually over time, the language of wider society displaced the minority language mother tongue. Migrants are virtually monolingual in their mother tongue. Their children are bilingual, and their grandchildren are often monolingual in the language of host country. At first, migrants use the host language in limited domains and reserve the home domain for their mother tongue, but soon the host language gradually infiltrates their home through the children.
because their children may encounter the host language first on TV but are compelled to using it for survival at school. Then, this language turns to be the families eventually shift from using their mother tongue at home to using the host country language. And also, language shift may take 3 to 4 generations to occur. And the question, why do we need to shift? What are the reasons why do we need to shift? So first, to assimilate the original monolingual community. Second, to be a member of the new community. For example, in the countries like England, the school is one of the first domains in which children of migrant families meet English. So, they have to use English because it is the only means of communicating to other people. Since we are now done discussing the migrant minorities, we will now discuss the non-migrant community. Language shift is not always the result of migration. Political, economic, and social changes can occur within a community, and this may result in linguistic changes to as what was mentioned earlier. It is also a rule that more domains in which a minority language is used, the more likely it will be maintained. Where minority language have resisted language shift the longest, there has been at least one exclusive domain for the minority language. Generally, the religious domains is the most resistant to language shift until now. For example, Latin, Hungarian, and Arabic are used in Latin Roman Church, overword prayers, and Islamic rites. And for additional information, language shift may occur when the main language of a region or country is needed for employment opportunities and wider communication. At this time, we will answer the question, how can a minority language be maintained? The first one is, a language can be maintained if a language is an important identity marker. A language can be maintained and preserved when it is highly valued as an important symbol of ethnic identity for the minority group. Second, the language can be maintained if a minority group is cohesive. Next, a language can be maintained if a minority group keeps close contact with the homeland because it contributes to language maintenance. Lastly, the language can be maintained if a minority language gets institutional support. For example, in the USA or in Davao City, Chinese people who live in the Chinatown area of big cities are much likely to maintain a Chinese dialect as their mother tongue. And thank you for listening. That's all for the language shift in different communities.